Now I'm pleased to introduce you to our first speaker, Dan Rohinton. Dan joined IA Global Asset Management in 2022 to lead the dividend team and manage the IA Global Dividend Fund. He is a passionate fundamental researcher with a keen eye for finding advantage business models around the globe. Dan and his team have embraced a proprietary risk management framework to optimize risk-adjusted returns for clients. Prior to joining IA Global Asset Management, Dan was at CI Global Asset Management and its predecessor brand, CI Cambridge, for the last 10 years. During his time at CI, Dan was portfolio manager and team leader for the CI Global Concentrated Equities team. Dan and his research team diligently managed over $3 billion in clients' hard-earned savings across several global dividend and global equity portfolios. Before taking on leadership responsibility, Dan was responsible for conducting deep fundamental research across the global financials and real estate sector. In addition, Dan implemented a robust risk management program across CI for equity derivatives to enhance returns and lower risk. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Rohinton.
Hey everyone. So before we get started, found my clicker there. I did get a few extra raffle tickets from Brian, so I'm looking forward to winning that air fryer over there. So I don't like your guys' odds there, but let's get started. Let's talk about global, let's talk about the world. I'm tempted to yell. Can you all hear my voice? Okay, maybe I'll do that. Yeah, let's do that. So when we look at the world, there's a lot going on. But you got to remember, it's always been like this. There's always been a lot going on. And the first thing that when you're looking at markets all around the world is you can't look at that map because it's not going to tell you how the world actually is for you and your family and your extended family. Because economies don't look like the map up there. Canada's not that big, Russia's not that big, Africa's a lot smaller. Economically, there's really a few centers of influence. So when you're looking at the world around you, you got to start there. Because that's the way that the market, the economic output and productivity of the world is. But that's not all. You got to go a step further. The stock markets are so much different than even the geographic map and the economic map you see there. The US gets so much bigger. The UK gets so much bigger. So when you see what's out there and what we see, I see Japan as one of the leaders in global automation. I see China as a future market that's going to grow and develop. India is the same. France has some of the best luxury companies all around the world. Italy has some of the best tire and automotive companies all around the world. Switzerland's basically half Nestle, so I'll leave that out. Netherlands, same deal. There's one stock that dominates half the market. Denmark, another one, and I'll get to that one specifically because it's called Novo Nordisk. The UK is diverse and a lot deeper. It's got a deeper capital pool. And Canada is great for dinosaur juice. That's oil and gas. Unfortunately, I wish as a Canadian, as a Torontonian, I wish there was more than banks and basically energy companies and resource extraction. I wish there were more Shopifys. I went to school at Wilfrid Laurier University. I grew up in Whitby, Oshawa. I wish there was more out there, but unfortunately, Canada, I wish was bigger in this map, but it's just not. But that's not what we're here to talk about. I think the most important thing that we focus on all the time, and I know the team at Langlois does as well, is to make sure that you're not that red dot over there. This is the 20-year history in financial markets. I told you a lot's gone on, and it has, but it's been a great 20 years. But why is the average investor in the average market only doing 3.6%? It's simple. You buy high, you sell low, and you do it over and over and over again. Because human emotion is the hardest job of our job and the Langlois team as well. Because at the end of the day, staying invested in a world where information is at your fingertips is not easy. And I'll give you an example. My mentor and the founder of our prior team at CI, Alan Radlow, he had worked for Fidelity for decades and decades and decades. Maybe not that many decades, a few decades. And one of the things he'd always tell me is 50 years ago, it was easy. Fidelity had a fax machine, but everyone else got their earnings in the mail. So Fidelity had a competitive advantage because they literally got the news 2 days earlier than everyone else. Now every single one of us on our phones, every single second, can get live and updated information. And frankly, too much information. Because you know what that encourages us to do? It encourages us to trade. It encourages people to buy high, sell low, and do it over and over again. So the last 20 years have been good. You could have picked anything. But why did we end up with 3.6%? It's because we traded too much and we just let our emotions get the best of us. So more than anything, as a portfolio manager, I'll get into some details. We'll talk macro, we'll talk markets, we'll do all of that. But at the end of the day, it's that human emotion, that human psychology, that is the hardest part of my job. That's the hardest part of Brian and Mike's job. And it's the hardest part for you to take hold of and seize as well. So the other question I always get all the time is, look, there's thousands of stocks out there. How do you not drown in the ocean? And it's simple, you got to cluster it. You got to organize it. You can't look at one thing in isolation. You got to see the full picture. So I told you I was from Whitby, Oshawa. There's a big GM plant there. There's a big steel mill there that I could see from the window of my house, which I'm starting to realize is maybe not the best for my lung capacity. But you can see just how complicated the automobile sector actually is when you really boil it down. So that Brafasco plant was the steel mill. It's at the very start of when the car is first built. Then you go over to the actual suppliers, your Johnson Controls, your Magnas of the world. Then the actual companies, the Toyotas, the General Motors, the Ford, and Stellantis, which is now the name for Chrysler. Then you go further away. When you go buy the car, you probably need an auto loan. So there's banks to do that. When your car first needs its oil change, winter tires, and some small dents, maybe a door got knocked off in an accident, things like that. I'm just kidding, by the way. You go to your dealer and you get it fixed. Then 10 years go by, 13 years go by, you're thinking, this scrap heap of a car, I can't go to the service center and pay for $1,000 for a new door. I'm just going to try to install some of this stuff myself. The hobby mechanics as you get to the average age of 13 and onwards. And then finally, you go to the junkyard. It's literally just scrap and parts of an engine and maybe a wheel left. And you got to take it to the salvage yard. You got to look at all of that. All these companies are global. They're all over the place. You've got to put all the pieces together. And one of the things that blew me away was Ford and Chrysler, GM, all these companies don't make money. They barely make any money. I remember the strikes with the UAW that became Unifor. I remember whether the next production facility or the next model of the truck was going to go to our GM plant or was it going to go somewhere in Mexico. All of that stress, all that hassle, all the other things that go into it. And they don't make any money. That's the reality when you do the analysis. So when you're looking at the automobile sector, one of the surprising conclusions for me was all the hard work I saw around at GM didn't really count for much. And the companies that's selling you replacement wipers, mufflers, is making 10 times more money than GM and Ford is for the same dollar of revenue. So you get this type of insight when you look around the world, and you'll see some companies like Apple basically dominate the handset market, and they take all of the profits. But you got to do the analysis this way. The other thing you got to appreciate is Amazon, Google, all the household names we have are not unique to just Canada and North America. So I'll use Amazon as an example. So who's heard of Alibaba? Okay, cool. JD.com? Oh, there's usually one hand. So that's the competitor to Alibaba in China. Then there's Pinduoduo, which is the competitor to the others in China as well. There's a Shopee, which is the Amazon of Southeast Asia. Then you got Rakuten, the Amazon of Japan. And then finally, Mercado Libre. It's the Amazon in the Amazon. They're literally in Brazil serving packages in Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil specifically. So you learn a lot by looking all around the world. There's so many other examples of that. There's a WhatsApp and there's an Instagram, basically in every country in Asia the same way. So you've got to look at the world globally. You've got to look at things holistically because everything is interconnected. So that's all a good background, just how we do our work, how we think. And I just wanted to talk about the market a little bit too. And some of the things to really think about, you've probably heard, well, there's a recession coming. And I'll agree, I'll say there is a recession coming. Except my job isn't to look at the news, read the news today. As a portfolio manager, what we already are reading right here, right now, was priced in 12 months ago. My job is to predict the news and what the newspapers will say 5 years from now. That's my responsibility. So whatever the Globe's telling you today, it's already in the stocks. It's what's the Globe and Mail, if it's still around by 2025, 2028, what's it going to say then? What's going to be the top headline? And I'll get into that. But right now we're talking recession. And they're probably right. But everyone's already predicted that. And everyone's priced that into the stocks. There's no portfolio model that we do where we don't have a recession scenario. And that's not our base case scenario. We basically think of that as our base case. So the market's already pricing in a pretty big slowdown. And some of the data you can see, we had a big boom after COVID. So we all got confused by what the base rate is, what's normal. So we went completely shut down, and then we opened right back up. And everywhere, including services, retail, consumers started spending. And the weirdest term got created. It's called revenge spending, where you're deprived of that vacation, and then you went on 2 vacations to make up for it. So that's been going on. That's underpinning the market, some of the consumer demand, things like that. And we had a lot of savings, billions and billions of dollars, actually hundreds of billions of dollars. And that was broken down by different cohorts. There's a lot of different details we can get into. But the punchline is, this was the first time in history the government said, here you go, here's a paycheck, keep sitting on your couch. And that's basically what happened. And there were good reasons for that, because we didn't want to have another depression like we did in the 30s, things like that. But the reality is, when you have a paycheck and you can't spend it, aside from a premium subscription to Netflix, which might just mean you get 2 more screens, that's not very useful. So we had all this excess savings, and then everything opened up. So you went from getting 2 vacations to maybe going for nice dinners in those vacations, things like that. So that revenge spending is still going on, but it's starting to peter out. So we're going back to below trend and normal trends of savings. That's the big 10,000-foot picture. But this is also a little bit different depending on your income quartile. So in the US, if you're making $125,000 to $200,000 and above, you've still got excess savings. If you're making less than $50,000, you're already running up the credit card. So you got to look under the hood. I'm not a fan of averages in our work, because averages don't tell the real story. And the other thing that's going on, and we've probably noticed it a little bit, it's getting harder to get a loan. Because as banks are realizing that the consumer basically went from tons of savings to back to a normal level of saving, they're not as creditworthy as they were before. So there's changes going on under the hood in the consumer and what they're able to afford. And the other thing too is that interest rates are generally high, and that's being passed on to the consumer. So Oliver and I, who's my co-PM, we both bought houses last year. So lucky us, our refinancing's coming up, and they quoted me 7.5%. So that'll be fun. January's going to be fun. But the point being is, as interest rates get higher and higher, it's harder for people whose incomes haven't caught up with inflation to be able to afford the same lifestyles and living as their savings rate has gone back to normal, that excess savings has come back down, and the banks are saying, look, you don't have the cash cushion that you used to, so we're being a little bit more careful and cautious in what we're lending out. I think over the long term, that's a good thing. Over the short term, it's going to mean a little bit of trade down here and there, and there's ways that we all participate in that. So it's just the macro picture. The other element is wages are catching up. I just told you about the UAW strike. Any guesses what they got as a wage raise? 25? I heard it 25. There you go. It was 25. That's pretty strong, along with the potential for the battery plants and things like that. So as the inflation has been more and more in our psychology, in our psyche, people are asking for more money because that's what they deserve, because every year you're not getting a few percent. It's a real pay cut for you. Chicken's just getting more expensive. So that's led to basically wages coming back up and employment remaining tight. But I wouldn't really bet on that over a 5-year horizon, because a lot of the reasons we talk about the 1970s as if it was yesterday and it's going to be our future, but the demographics were different. We're more likely as a society as a whole, like I'm talking the entire Western Hemisphere and things like that, like big hundreds of millions of people. We have the demographics of Japan, or are approaching that. Japan just got there 20, 30 years early. So could inflation rip and roar for 5, 7% per year for the next 10 years? I doubt it, because who can afford 7, 8% mortgages for 10, 20, 30 years? It's not sustainable in that way. So you never say never, because my job is not absolutes, it's probabilities. I think there's a pretty low chance that rates are going to be high for the very long term. I also don't think, and I'll get to it in a minute, that we're going to zero for the long term either. So we're getting our wages back. Every quartile, whether you're low-end, skilled to high-skilled labor, you're getting wages that are catching up to where inflation has been. But my point to you is that inflation has gone through a very unique period right now, and it's probably resetting at a lower rate, and it's unlikely to be very high, and it's unlikely to be the financial craziness that we had 5 years ago. And you see it in the employment rate. After all this talk of recession, no one's lost their job. It's barely starting, and we've had the best labor market in 100 years across the US and consequently Canada as well. I always just think of Canada as an extra state in the United States. Maybe that's a little dangerous of a topic to get into, but my point is employment has been very, very good. Wages have been catching. So we are getting back some of the inflation that we were initially giving up through the wage contracts. But that's also normalizing. I told you inflation's normalizing. The wages are going to normalize back to a normal level too, and so will unemployment. And the reason I know that is, yes?
I gotta ask the question.
Sure.
What is the logic behind raising mortgage rates and the bank continually raising mortgage rates? Why do they keep putting more and more money in their pocket?
So I don't work for the bank, but I'll try to give
Yeah,
a balance.
you would know better than anybody.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you sort of my apolitical opinion on it. It's not that they're necessarily making, believe it or not, the banks are earning lower returns today than they were 2, 3 years ago. And there's a whole bunch of complex reasons for it. But basically, they don't make, if interest rates were 10%, they'd be giving you 8% GICs and they'd still be earning 2%. If interest rates were 0 and they were giving you a 2% mortgage, you'd be getting GICs at 0 and the banks would be earning 2%. So the banks, believe it or not, aren't actually making any more money. It's all passed through. But my point being is, in general, it was all because of supply bottlenecks, things like that. I remember when the store shelves all used to be empty. That's all coming, we're past that period now. So don't think this is necessarily, because I was actually on BNN a few weeks ago, and it was when Justin Trudeau was lambasting the grocery stores for price gouging. I'm thinking, what does Galen have to do with any of this? Like, the whole cost of producing chickens are just more, there's basically like a chicken disease. And chickens, whenever we go to Chick-fil-A or we talk about this stuff, it always talks about the protein cycle, so we nerd out. But the point being is, the grocery stores aren't really making much more money than they were before. 1% more to be specific than they were in the past. It's all passed through because of unique factors that happen. Because there were 100 ships at the port of LA that were waiting to dock. There was double ordering, triple ordering. There's so many complex supply chain issues because a lot of our goods coming from China and Asia and back and forth. And then what happened with food is there was a war. And the second part was there was a chicken flu. And then there was a African swine flu, which was, believe it or not, called pig Ebola in China for years. So there's specific reasons why protein got more expensive, but generally food got more expensive. And then other stuff, general merchandise, t-shirts and everything got more expensive. But it's not necessarily that there's really price gouging going on. They're taking a little bit, but it's not the big pie that you might initially think.
It's carbon tax.
No, it's not that either, actually. It's really...
Keep your program. We can't stop here anytime. Just go through your program.
Sorry.
Sure, no worries. I'll just say, there's a lot of things I could say about energy and our policy and nuclear and how much more we could do, but the data would not say it's a carbon tax. And not even in Europe either. So maybe I'll take a pause there, but just to answer your question.
Thanks.
So where I was really getting at on inflation and where we are with unemployment is it's low. It's the best market in 100 years. But as you see the early signs, you're not going to fire full-time staff if you're a company that's seeing slowing demand. you start with temporary workers. So you're seeing that after a boom and a spike through COVID and past COVID, we're going back to layoffs for temporary workers. So things are slowing down at the bleeding edge of unemployment. So the unemployment rate will likely rise, and because interest rates are so high, they'll likely fall. These are what we call in the market automatic stabilizers that take place. That's why recessions don't end up being that scary for markets sometimes, and boom times don't end up being that good because we as investors, we just look past that transient period. It's just that COVID was a pretty transient and weird period. But the other part that's weird, believe it or not, is the last 7 years before that. So I remember in 2019, I heard about what from the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, the Napa Valley fire drill. I was like, oh, this is interesting. What are you guys talking about? So one of the venture capitalists, he was the founder of LinkedIn, basically put his money in this firm, and it was one of the partners there. And he'd be driving to Napa on a Friday afternoon. Start the weekend off early, that's cool. And then he gets a call from Apple engineers that just quit the company. And they said, hey, they have XYZ idea, it's really not that important because it happened all the time. And they want $5 million. Okay, decent sized seed round for employees that used to work at a reputable company, cool. Let's see how it goes. He had to drive back, and he had no choice, because back then, I'm talking 2019, before those real negative yielding bonds, zero money, there's no alternative, stuff really got going. He had to drive back because if he didn't come back and take that meeting that afternoon, those guys would walk out Sunday with $25 million from 5 other competitors that were racing to get in. So what you saw in the world, really from the 2016 to 2021, 2022 era, was the weirdest time since Tulip Mania. And that was a long time ago. So financial history will remember the last decade, and for good reason. Because negative yielding debt, the idea that you give the government $100 and then you give them a $1 or $2 every year, that wasn't normal. But that's how it felt. So any Tom, Dick, and Harry with any crazy idea, the money just flew their way. That's over. So before we get into tortillas and tacos, and I'll give Oliver a chance to talk about that, have you heard of Ozempic? Okay, I heard a lot of, okay. So Ozempic's interesting, and this will wind into tacos at some point. But when you think of Ozempic, I can't go anywhere without seeing ads for it. And I'll tell you, it is one of the most important, significant things that has happened based on the information we currently have. If we find out that it causes cancer and all that stuff, like throw everything I said out the window. But based on the current information, there's 140 million Americans that are overweight and obese. That's a lot of people. There's only 500,000 people on Ozempic right now. Why is that important? Ozempic, I remember when we used to own the Novo Nordisk in the, 7, 8 years ago, Oliver? Something like that? They would always talk about it and say, Dan, you know, we're a diabetes company, we make insulins, we made this product called Ozempic, it's a hormone treatment. I don't want to get into the science of it because it's really not the point. They thought, hey, we've noticed in our patient population, when they take it, they tend to lose weight. So we'll commission the study. Turns out that study is accurate. On average, people lose 17% of their body weight in a year. Versus someone who's basically on a placebo, which is sugar water, like the control group, if you will, in the science studies, they lose 2-3%. Because, you know, if you're on a study about weight loss, you might go to the gym a little bit more, you might skip a few desserts here and there. But 17% of your body weight in just over a year is a big, big deal. Because what happens with obesity? Cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, kidney issues. I think my kidney's there, somewhere there. Hips, ankles, knees, everything in between. It is the starting point for the other issues that afflict the US healthcare system, our own and other parts of the world. So if you're telling me there's an injection where you lose 17% of your body weight, and it probably works with some side effects, but nothing outlandish and crazy, at least not that we know of yet, there's issues that come with it because diabetics can't get the same treatment that they need because so many people are trying to sign up and get Ozempic. But it is a big deal because it's going to change the healthcare system in a big way. There's companies that specialize in robotic surgeries for gastrointestinal issues. Hip, knee, all those issues. There's companies that are all around the market in healthcare that are affected by this injection every single month. But that's not all. And I don't see we're a healthy crowd here with a little dose of alcohol mixed in. Usually there's a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi somewhere so I can use this as a prop. But what we're not talking about, and I told you my job's to predict 2025 and 2030. Imagine when 10 million Americans are on this drug. That's when it gets really interesting. Because what does Coke sell? Sugar water with a brand. What is a Dorito? It's carbs with some type of cheesy synthetic stuff on top. It's great. I love it too. I'm a fan. But when you're on Ozempic, what does it actually do to your biology? It suppresses your appetite. That's all it does. It doesn't make your stomach fire up at 2 times speed or anything like that. You just feel full and you don't feel like eating. It takes away your cravings because the drug hits the same hormone receptors that make you feel full. That's what this is. So what we've seen in the clinical data for Ozempic is people who are on it eat far less sugary food, far less fatty food, and far less sugary drinks, things like that. You literally stop eating the stuff that is the worst for you. And on top of that, when we've done focus groups with people who are currently on Ozempic, they say, Dan, I used to eat 3 meals a day, then I'd top it off with a bag of chips at night, and maybe I'd wash it down with a pop. Now I eat 1 meal a day, and I know I need to eat 2 because that's probably the healthy thing to do. So that is what's going on, is that your appetite is suppressing, and it's going to hit the demand for all these companies in all these consumer sectors that are selling you all this junky food. We talked about tobacco 25 years ago. We sued them for $200 billion, and we won, and for good reason. Call me crazy, but I think the Coca-Cola day of reckoning is coming. Because if 10, 20, 30 million Americans are on this treatment, and it's expensive right now, there's a lot of, call it teething issues that are taking place, that is going to happen. But look at the world 5, 10 years down the road. And the other thing to remember is that the averages don't tell the real story. When you're looking at the average drinker, most drinkers drink what? 0 to 0.02 drinks per, they take a sip of wine every week. 6 out of 10 Americans do that. The top customers for the alcohol companies, the 1 out of 10 consumers, they drink 74 drinks a week. That's over 10 a day. And then you have an 11th once in a while. So when you look at averages, you got to remember that the best customer for Hershey's is not having 1 little square of the chocolate bar. The best customer eats 9 chocolate bars a week. And what do you think? And do you think he's having a nice salad with that? No. No, not at all, right? So the best customer for these companies, the best pop drinkers, the best chocolate eaters, the best ice cream eaters, the best worst food for your health, is probably the most obese and overweight. So they're probably first in line to get Ozempic. And they probably should be. It's better for the healthcare system, it's better for them. It's just bad for Coke. It's bad for Frito-Lay, Pepsi, things like that. So what do you do in that type of environment? And I'll finally get to tacos in a second with Oliver. But when you're really thinking about what's going on here, it's that there's a change in the consumer behavior that we'll see in the next 10 years. Because people are on Ozempic right now, and it's just one drug. I'm not getting a commission from Novo Nordisk for saying all this stuff. I'm just saying it because the science bears it out from what we know now. We know that they eat more protein, more full carbs, and less of the sugary, unhealthy stuff. So we're going to see a shift in the consumer share of throat, is what we call alcohol consumption and how we measure the math on that, and the share of the plate. So that is the change that Ozempic and these types of GLP-1 semaglutide drugs is going to bring. And it is something just to watch, because sometimes my job is opportunity management. It's always diversification management. And times like this, when it comes to consumer, it's risk management. Because we can't own the companies that are going to be in the firing line of these issues and these headwinds for the next decade. And with that, I want to introduce you to Oliver. We've worked together for years from CI and at IA as well. And he's been our consumer specialist and at the forefront. So off the tacos, Oliver.
So, because the number of Mexicans in the US are growing, it follows that the number of people who are eating tortillas are growing. And it just so happens that tortillas are a low price elasticity good. And what does that mean? It means that it's cheap, right? So if you raise the price by 5%, 3%, well, it happens that the volumes don't change all that much. So what did Dan just say? Consumers are feeling the pinch a little bit, right? And in this environment, what do you want to own? You want to own something where they can raise a little bit price and the volume doesn't really change. So that's pretty much why we own Gruma. Instead of something like Coke, instead of something like Hershey's, which in 5 to 10 years could see the volumes drop off a cliff. We went all around the world and we found Gruma and Mexican tortilla business. And while we're on the topic of consumers feeling the pinch, if anyone has been to Winners, you'll basically know what Ross does. Ross is another company that we own in the portfolio, and it's a discount apparel retailer. And I think that retail, it's generally a tough business, and I would normally agree with that. But remember what we said earlier, value chains, right? So we strip apart the apparel value chain, and Ross is good because the apparel value chain is so bad. So if we go to malls during especially Christmas time, Black Fridays, what do we find? Deals everywhere, right? You got 30% off, 40% off, 50% off. So the actual apparel industry, around 30 to 40% of the sales every year is made by goods on sale. So what does that mean? It means that sometimes guys like Gap, guys like Old Navy, Banana Republic, blah, 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 they have an issue with they have too much inventory and too little demand. So what do? They'll call up Ross and say, hey, I'm going to need you to take these inventory off my hands. And Ross would say, yes, we'll do that, but you got to give it to me at a really steep discount. And over time, the consumers will say, okay, instead of waiting every year for deal time, I could just go to Ross and buy stuff on discounts all year long. And so because of that, Ross has been gaining share year in and year out. And in a time period where consumers are feeling the pinch, Ross wins. And so by looking through value chains, we basically found Ross in a very, very terrible industry.
And one thing, the last thing I'll leave you guys with, because we don't need to get into too many stock stories, is this is just a few examples. The point we're really trying to show with this is whenever you hear something negative, you got to know that on the other side there's opportunity. So we told you about what's going on in consumer staples. But that's not purely a negative story, because there's companies out there. We told you about a consumer that's getting more frugal with their cash and their decisions. So there's an opportunity right there. So when you see all the headlines in the news, all the complexity, I just want you to go back to one chart and keep remembering this. It's a little bit early in the deck. It's this one. You know why? Because it's those headlines, all that stuff that you hear. That's what creates investors at 3.6% when they could have had 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% per year. So never look at the headline today and say, oh my God, I got to make a decision. Oh my God, I got to sell everything. I got to do all this. It's time in the market, not timing it, because if you're going to cash right away, my question that naturally comes up, and something we would always talk about, is when do you jump back in? Because it'll never feel like the right time. So when you see some of these risks, when you have some of these questions, always remember, you don't want to be that 3.6%. You can do better than that. Thank you guys.